The 1972 Academy Awards ceremony at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, March 27, 8:30 in the evening. Paul Newman walked to the podium to present the award for Best Picture, and 30 million Americans watching on television saw something they'd never seen before at the Oscars. John Wayne, sitting in the third row wearing his perfectly tailored tuxedo, arms crossed over his massive chest, face carved from stone, watched Newman approach the microphone. Newman made a joke about how old-fashioned westerns were becoming outdated in modern cinema, how the genre needed to evolve or die, and suggested that films about morally complex characters were the future of American storytelling. The room laughed politely, appreciating the gentle ribbing at a genre everyone assumed was past its prime. But John Wayne didn't laugh. He stood up, all 6 feet 4 inches of him, and walked directly down the center aisle toward the exit. Every camera in the building followed him. His jaw was clenched, so tight you could see the muscles working. His massive frame moved with deliberate purpose toward the doors at the back of the theater. Paul Newman stopped mid-sentence and watched him leave. The room went completely silent for 3 full seconds, which on live television feels like an eternity. This wasn't a bathroom break. This was a statement. This was John Wayne, the most powerful star in Hollywood for 4 decades, publicly rejecting everything Paul Newman represented. What most people watching at home didn't know, what even most people in that room didn't fully understand, was that this moment had been building for 20 years. 2 of the biggest stars in Hollywood history, 2 men who represented completely opposite philosophies of what it meant to be a man on screen, what it meant to tell stories about America, what it meant to show masculinity to a nation that was desperately trying to figure out what masculinity even was anymore. And a mutual contempt that both men had worked very hard to hide from the public, because admitting it would have forced them to articulate exactly why they couldn't stand each other's approach to the craft they'd both dedicated their lives to. John Wayne represented old Hollywood, the studio system, moral clarity, heroic masculinity, America as it wanted to see itself in the mirror. Strong, righteous, unambiguous, clear about right and wrong. Paul Newman represented New Hollywood, the actor as artist, moral ambiguity, flawed men struggling with internal demons, America as it actually was when you looked closely enough to see the cracks in the foundation. Complex, contradictory, psychologically damaged, unsure about anything. Behind closed doors, in private conversations that only emerged years later, through biographer interviews and off-the-record comments from directors who worked with both men, John Wayne called Paul Newman's method acting approach psychological masturbation. Paul Newman called John Wayne's westerns fascist propaganda for people who were afraid of moral complexity. Neither man ever said these things publicly because they were professionals and they understood that Hollywood was a business built on maintaining certain illusions. But everyone in the industry knew. The tension between them was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and every time they ended up at the same industry event, people watched to see what would happen, whether the facade would finally crack and the real contempt would spill out into public view. In 1969, 3 years before that Oscar walkout, there was a private conversation at a Directors Guild dinner. Multiple witnesses, including director Sam Peckinpah, who told the story years later, heard John Wayne tell Paul Newman something that made Newman's face go completely white. What Wayne said that night, the specific words he used to articulate exactly why he couldn't respect Newman's style, revealed everything about why this wasn't just a professional disagreement between 2 actors. This was about the end of an era. This was about the last representative of the old guard facing the first major star of the new, and the most powerful man in Hollywood refusing to accept that his time was over, that his vision of American masculinity was dying, that everything he'd built his career on was being systematically dismantled by a younger generation that thought his approach was not just outdated, but actively harmful. If this clash between 2 legends representing completely different visions of American masculinity already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button for Emma's Theater right now, because what we are about to reveal about why Wayne couldn't stand Newman will change how you see every Western and every method actor that came after. We bring you the conflicts that shaped Hollywood. And drop a comment below telling me, have you ever watched someone succeed using a completely different approach than yours and felt like their success invalidated everything you believed in, even when you knew they were talented? Share that feeling. I read every single comment. John Wayne's entire philosophy of acting could be summarized in one sentence that he actually said in multiple interviews throughout his career. "I don't act, I react." He believed that acting was not about finding the character inside yourself through psychological excavation or emotional memory, or any of the techniques that method actors spent years studying at places like the Actors Studio. Acting, to Wayne, was about embodying an ideal that audiences needed to see, about being the hero rather than understanding the hero psychologically, about providing something larger than life that people could look up to and believe in when their own lives felt small and uncertain. He made 142 films over 5 decades, and in almost every single one of them, he played essentially the same archetype. The same walk, the same voice, the same physical presence, the same moral certainty. He never disappeared into roles because disappearing wasn't the point. The point was to be John Wayne consistently, reliably, exactly what audiences expected every single time they bought a ticket. And it worked spectacularly. During the Depression, people needed to believe that strong men still existed who couldn't be broken by economic collapse. During World War II, people needed to see heroic masculinity defeating evil, even though Wayne himself never served a day in combat. During the Cold War, people needed moral clarity in a world that felt increasingly complex and threatening. Wayne understood something fundamental about human psychology. His job wasn't to provide reality. His job was to provide myth. And myth served a function that reality couldn't fulfill. Paul Newman's philosophy was the complete opposite, and he learned it at the Actors Studio in New York under Lee Strasberg, studying the method technique that required actors to draw from their own psychological trauma, their own real emotions, their own lived experience, to create authentic human behavior on screen. Newman believed that acting was excavating truth, that characters should be complex and contradictory and real, that audiences deserved more than comfortable lies about heroic masculinity. His breakthrough role in 1956 was playing Rocky Graziano in Somebody Up There Likes Me, a violent, traumatized boxer with no heroic qualities whatsoever, just raw human damage rendered with psychological precision. Then came Brick and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in 1958, an alcoholic who was possibly closeted and definitely broken, exploring masculinity as both performance and prison. Then Fast Eddie in The Hustler in 1961, arrogant, self-destructive, morally ambiguous, the anti-hero as protagonist in a way that American cinema had rarely attempted before. Newman's core belief was that truth was more valuable than comfort, that men were complex and often broken and rarely purely heroic, and that pretending otherwise was an insult to the audience's intelligence. Where Wayne saw his job as providing archetypal heroes that people could aspire to, Newman saw his job as providing psychological reality that people could recognize in themselves. These two philosophies couldn't coexist peacefully because Wayne's approach required Newman's to be wrong. If complex, flawed protagonists were valid, if psychological realism was the future of cinema, if audiences actually preferred moral ambiguity to moral clarity, then everything John Wayne had built over 40 years, his entire career, his entire identity, his entire understanding of what it meant to be a man on screen, became invalid. It became a lie. It became something that needed to be left behind as American cinema matured and grew up and stopped telling fairy tales. The generational divide made this inevitable. Wayne was born in 1907 and raised on Victorian concepts of masculinity, on frontier mythology, on the idea that men should be strong and silent and certain. Newman was born in 1925 and came of age during World War II, when the reality of combat destroyed a lot of romantic notions about heroism, when psychological trauma became something that couldn't be ignored anymore, when the complexity of human behavior in extreme situations made simple moral categories feel childish. 18 years separated them, but it might as well have been 18 centuries for how differently they understood what masculinity meant and what stories about men should look like. The first public clash happened in 1958 at a Hollywood Foreign Press dinner where Wayne was receiving an honorary award. Paul Newman was sitting at a table nearby, a relatively new star at that point but already making waves with his intense, psychologically driven performances. Wayne's acceptance speech praised actors who understand their responsibility to audiences, who show them the best of what men can be rather than the worst. Everyone in that room knew exactly who he was talking about. He was talking about method actors, about the actors' studio graduates, about the new generation that thought suffering on screen was the same thing as talent. Paul Newman visibly stiffened in his seat, but said nothing publicly, maintained his composure, didn't take the bait. But witnesses reported that after the ceremony, Newman approached Wayne and asked directly if that comment had been directed at him. Wayne's response was brief and devastating. "If the shoe fits, wear it." Newman walked away without responding, but the battle lines had been drawn. Two completely incompatible visions of what American cinema should be, what American masculinity should look like, and neither man willing to concede an inch. Throughout the 1960s, Hollywood split into two ideological camps, and the divide ran deeper than just acting technique or artistic preference. This was about what America needed from its stories, what function cinema served in the culture, whether movies were supposed to inspire audiences or challenge them. Old Hollywood, Wayne's camp, believed that movies should uplift rather than depress, that heroes should be heroic rather than conflicted, that America needed myths to believe in, especially during times of social upheaval. "We're in the dream business, not the reality business," became their rallying cry. New Hollywood, Newman's camp, believed that movies should reflect reality rather than fantasy, that complexity was more interesting and more honest than simplicity, that America was grown up enough to handle the truth about itself and its history. "We're artists, not propagandists," became their counterargument. The cultural context made this battle inevitable. The civil rights movement was exposing American hypocrisy about equality and justice. The Vietnam War was destroying faith in military heroism and government authority. The counterculture was questioning every traditional value that the previous generation had taken for granted. John Wayne's vision of America, the vision he'd been selling in films for 40 years, was collapsing in real time, and he could see it happening but couldn't stop it. Wayne took this personally in a way that went beyond professional competition. He had built a 40-year career playing one archetype, the strong, silent, morally certain American man who protected the weak and punished the wicked and never questioned whether he was doing the right thing. If that archetype was outdated, if audiences no longer wanted it, if critics dismissed it as simplistic and naive, then Wayne himself was outdated. His entire identity, not just as an actor but as a man, was wrapped up in that archetype. And Paul Newman's success proved that Wayne's approach was dying. The box office numbers told a story that Wayne didn't want to hear. Newman's film HUD in 1963 featured a protagonist who was selfish, cruel, and completely unredeemable, and it was a massive commercial and critical hit. Cool Hand Luke in 1967 made an anti-authority rebel who refused to conform into a folk hero, and audiences loved it. Meanwhile, Wayne's traditional westerns were still making money, but the cultural conversation had moved on. Critics were calling his films dated, calling his performance style one-dimensional, suggesting that he'd been playing himself for so long that he'd forgotten how to actually act. And the industry was validating Newman's approach with Oscar nominations and critical acclaim while dismissing Wayne as a relic of a simpler time that America had outgrown. The breaking point came at the 1969 Directors Guild dinner. Both men were in attendance, Wayne sitting with directors John Ford and Henry Hathaway, who'd worked with him for decades, Newman there to present an award. Newman's presentation praised new approaches to American storytelling, mentioned the importance of moving beyond simple good versus evil narratives, talked about cinema's responsibility to reflect the moral complexity of the modern world. Wayne's table went silent. You could feel the temperature drop. After the dinner, near the bar, Wayne approached Newman directly. Multiple witnesses, including director Sam Peckinpah, heard the entire exchange, and Peckinpah told the story years later in interviews, describing it as one of the most tense confrontations he'd ever witnessed between two major stars. Wayne told Newman that his generation thought complicated equaled deep, that the truth was they were afraid of being clear about right and wrong, that they hid behind psychology because they didn't have the guts to take a moral stand. "That's not sophistication," Wayne said, his voice low and hard. "That's cowardice." Newman went silent for what Peckinpah estimated was 10 full seconds, just staring at Wayne, processing what had just been said. Then Newman responded with equal intensity. "Your generation thinks clarity equals courage," Newman said. "Truth is, you're afraid of complexity because it requires thought." You hide behind myths because reality is too hard to face. That's not strength. That's denial. Both men just stared at each other after that, neither willing to back down, neither willing to continue the argument in front of witnesses. Wayne turned and walked away. They never had a private conversation again. This confrontation poisoned any possibility of professional collaboration. Multiple westerns were offered over the next few years with roles for both men, opportunities to work together that would have been commercially massive. Wayne rejected every single one. He told producers directly that he wouldn't share screen with someone who didn't understand what they were supposed to be doing, who thought tearing down heroes was the same thing as creating art. The few times they had to interact at award shows and industry events, the politeness was glacial, the tension visible to everyone in the room. Cameras caught it every time, the way they avoided each other, the stiffness when they had to shake hands for photographs, the complete absence of warmth between two men who should have had mutual respect as the biggest stars of their respective generations. And then came the 1972 Academy Awards, the moment when the private contempt became public spectacle. Paul Newman was presenting Best Picture, standing at the podium in front of Hollywood's elite and 30 million television viewers. He made what seemed like gentle jokes about old-fashioned westerns becoming outdated, about the genre needing to evolve or die to remain relevant in modern cinema. The room laughed because it seemed like harmless industry humor, the kind of self-aware commentary that Oscar ceremonies had always included. But John Wayne, sitting in the third row, didn't laugh. He took it as a personal attack, as Newman publicly declaring that everything Wayne represented was finished, that his entire career and the values he'd spent 40 years embodying on screen were relics that needed to be buried so that cinema could move forward. Wayne stood up in the middle of Newman's presentation, his massive frame rising from his seat, and walked straight down the center aisle toward the exit. Every camera in the building followed him. 30 million people watched him leave. Newman paused mid-sentence, acknowledged it with a comment that got nervous laughter. Well, that's one way to respond to criticism, but everyone in that room knew they'd just witnessed something unprecedented. John Wayne had publicly walked out on Paul Newman, had refused to even sit through his presentation, had made a statement that couldn't be misinterpreted. The official story afterward was that Wayne needed to use the restroom, that it was unfortunate timing, but nothing personal. Everyone knew it was a lie. Newman told reporters later that he'd struck a nerve, and the satisfaction in his voice was clear.
Good, he said.
The battle between these two visions of American cinema, these two philosophies of what it meant to be a man on screen, had finally exploded into public view. But the real question, the question that would take decades to answer, was which vision was actually right. In the short term, Newman's approach won decisively. The 1970s belonged to New Hollywood completely. Wayne's film The Cowboys in 1972 made $7.5 million domestically. Newman's film The Sting in 1973 made $159 million. The numbers told a story that was impossible to ignore. Traditional westerns were being dismissed by critics as dated and simplistic. Anti-heroes and psychologically complex protagonists were being celebrated as the future of American storytelling. Newman's approach had become the industry standard, the template that young actors studied, the style that won awards and critical respect. Vietnam had destroyed faith in military heroism. Watergate had destroyed faith in authority figures. America didn't want simple heroes anymore because simple heroes felt like lies designed to manipulate rather than inspire. Wayne's moral clarity felt naive in an era of moral complexity, and his refusal to adapt felt like stubbornness rather than integrity. But Wayne had been right about something that nobody wanted to admit in the 1970s. There's a psychological cost to constant deconstruction, to never having heroes, to treating every myth as a lie that needs to be exposed. Every institution was being questioned, every hero was being deconstructed, every simple narrative was being complicated until audiences were exhausted from the relentless complexity. Wayne had warned about this, had said that destroying all the myths without building something to replace them would leave people unmoored, without anything to believe in, without any shared stories that unified the culture. By the 1980s, audiences were tired of anti-heroes and moral ambiguity. They craved simple good versus evil stories again, wanted heroes they could root for without ironic distance, wanted to believe in something clear and uncomplicated. Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 was partially a return to Wayne's values, to the idea that America could be great and heroic and morally certain again. The pendulum was swinging back, not all the way, but enough to prove that Wayne had understood something fundamental about human psychological needs that Newman's generation had dismissed as unsophisticated. But Newman had been right about something equally important. You can't unknow what you know about American history. You can't return to simple good versus evil narratives after My Lai, after the Pentagon Papers, after learning what your government actually did in your name. Wayne's vision required a kind of innocence that was no longer possible once you'd seen the complexity beneath the surface. American cinema matured in the 1970s precisely because it started treating audiences as intelligent adults capable of handling moral ambiguity, psychological complexity, characters who weren't purely heroic or purely villainous. Films became respected as art globally because directors like Scorsese and Coppola and Altman refused to make the kind of simple myths that Wayne's generation had specialized in. Newman was right that growth requires facing uncomfortable realities, that myth-making without truth is just propaganda, that complexity isn't weakness, but honesty about how human beings actually function in morally complicated situations. The uncomfortable truth that neither man could admit, the synthesis that neither lived to fully see, was that both approaches were right in different ways at different times for different cultural moments.